All right, so I'm going to read our portion of Revelation, which is the next church, the fourth church of Thyatira, and then I'm going to explain a little something because we're sort of at a unique juncture in this process. So what we're going to read tonight is the Church of Thyatira, which corresponds to the Church of the Middle Ages or the medieval church, and it really corresponds. You know, this is one of the ones that really hits the nail on the head. So let's start in verse 18 of Revelation chapter 2. And to the angel of the church of Thyatira write, "These things says the Son of God, who has eyes like a flame of fire and his feet like fine brass. I know your works, love, service, faith, and your patience. And as for your works, the last are more than the first. Nevertheless, I have a few things against you, because you allow that woman, Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants to commit sexual immorality and to eat things sacrificed to idols. And I gave her time to repent of her sexual immorality, and she did not repent. Indeed, I will cast her into a sickbed, and those who commit adultery with her into great tribulation, unless they repent of their deeds. I will kill her children with death, and all the churches shall know that I am he who searches the minds and the hearts, and I will give to each one of you according to your works. Now to you I say, and to the rest in Thyatira, as many as you who have this doctrine, who have not known the depths of Satan, as they say, I will put on you no other burden, but hold fast what you have until I come. And he who overcomes and keeps my works until the end, to him I will give power over the nations. He shall rule with them with a rod of iron. They shall be dashed to pieces like the potter's vessels. And I also have received from my Father, and I will give him the morning star. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches." One thing to always notice when we're reading this is it always says what the Spirit says to the churches, not just to that church, but to all the churches. Now, we're at an interesting juncture over here, because the first three churches we studied, Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, right, in the timeline. This here brings us, as we said last week, to about AD 590. Right here. Okay? And these are, Ephesus was from the apostolic time to about 100 AD. Smyrna took us to about 313 AD. Pergamos takes us to 590 AD. The rest of them, as we read, each one of them is going to mention Jesus saying, I am coming. These ones, he didn't say anything about coming. Each one of these churches, he talks about when he comes, because they're still going to be around. So now these were sort of periods, and these are still periods too, but they still exist today. So the Church of Thyatira that we're going to study tonight still exists today, and you'll see why. And the Church of Sardis, which started, this goes to about, we're going to say 1517 or so, the beginning of the Reformation. And then this goes to, I think this goes to about 1690 to early 1700s. Okay, it's about right here. And then this goes to about 1900. But then they keep going. Okay? and they go until the return of Christ. And the Church of Laodicea he doesn't really give them, in one sense, he kind of doesn't give them an option to make things right. They're just, they just kind of ride out through the tribulation. But, these, in reality, these do too. The only one, he said, in Philadelphia, he says, because of your faithfulness, I will take you from the tribulation. And we just read, he talked about the tribulation tonight in that passage. for the remnants of this church, Thyatira, that will exist at the time of the rapture. So we're looking at the medieval church, starting at about 590, going to about 1517. So we're covering a lot of material, or at least a large span of time, 1,000 years, a whole millennia we're gonna cover tonight. Fortunately or unfortunately, it's a lot of the same, and none of it's very good. It's sort of a repetition of the same cycle. It's almost a little bit like reading the book of Judges, They just keep doing it, and they just keep doing it and not learning the lesson. But we start, before we get into this, is sort of a breakdown. Here's my little doodad here. Of what we're going to be covering tonight. The Holy Roman Empire, the decline of the Papacy, Islam and the Crusades, scholasticism, the renewal of monasticism, and then some heresy and pre-Reformation movements. But before we even get into that, I just want to talk briefly about one person named Gregory, and he was deemed Gregory the Great, it was a time when, again, it's 590 AD, and the empire has fallen. Remember, the empire fell in really 120 years before this. And the empire is really in ruins. There's no, there are emperors, so to speak, but they have no power. The Goths and the Visigoths and the Vandals and all these other the barbarians have come and invaded and sacked Rome, and it's changed hands so many times that they don't even know who these emperors are, and most of them are really, at this point, have changed hands and become more Germanic men than Italian or Roman men. And so in this time when there was sort of a vacuum of leadership, and then the Pope that we talked about last week, particularly Leo, was one that stood up and took a leadership role, took a leadership position. And here the same thing is happening in this time frame. There is a vacuum of leadership, and the Pope has died. So there's a double vacuum. And they need a new Pope, and they choose this man who would become Gregory, who didn't want to be Pope. He was a monk. He was a humble man. All he wanted to do was study the Word of God, was cloister himself away, and not deal with politics. But they hunted him down. They found him, and they said, "You're the guy. You're the only one that there is. You're the only one that we can put in this position." So he took the position. Was not an intellectual. More administrative. He managed things really well for the Vatican, but he was one that stepped in while the empire was faltering. And one thing he did do is he began to unite the churches. This is sort of a picture. I mean, we know what Europe looks like today. At the time of the Roman Empire, there was a unity. It was one thing. It was an empire. At this point, things are starting to break apart, and because of the lack of central leadership in Rome, you're getting little kingdoms. The kingdom of the Sways, the kingdom of the Visigoths, the kingdom of the Franks, the Burgundians, and the Ostrogoths, and these little kingdoms are starting to break up, and they're starting to become sort of autonomous on their own. And what Gregory did, because he didn't see himself as a political figure, he took himself as, the vicar of Christ, as the spiritual leader of what was left of the empire, and he united the churches. Some even consider him the first pope, because of the way that he, in a moment of crisis, in a moment of disorganization, he really brought things together and united the churches. And he was called God's counsel. That and at the time there was also a weakness, a new pope, a new leader, whatever, in the Eastern Empire, and so because normally they would have looked over there and said, well, at least we have the patriarch in the Eastern Church, but he was a new guy, and so he was just getting himself started, and Gregory took advantage of that in a sense that he pointed everybody back to Rome. And regained, so that Rome kept its primacy, so that Rome stayed as the, what everybody looked at, the capital, really the capital of the church, not just of the empire, but the capital of the church, the main headquarters of the church. One of the things that he's known for was sending another monk, a Benedictine monk named Augustine, not the Augustine that we talked about last week, a different Augustine, and he sent him to England, up here. And because it was all pagan. And it's just significant, particularly to us as Americans, because without the conversion of England, America would not be what America is, if you think about it. And the conversion, not to mention the fact that when we get to the Church of Philadelphia, we're going to see that England plays a major role in world missions. And having sent Augustine to Canterbury in England as a missionary to evangelize the Angles, the world would be a very different place. Now, his theology was a little muddled. He was a little bit like Augustine, but he tried to find a middle road. But not very successfully. Like I said, he wasn't an intellectual man. He was more of an administrator. He believed in predestination, but not irresistible grace. We talked about irresistible grace last week. He believed in original sin, but not inherited guilt. So he believed that Adam's sin damaged us, but that we still had the capability in our own, with God's grace, that we could still merit salvation. So he was sort of kind of muddled and trying to thread the needle somehow. He strengthened the idea of purgatory. There was one of his right-hand men had died. One of his bishops had died. And they found out that he was actually a really corrupt man. That he didn't know. He loved the guy, but he didn't know that he had been stealing from the church. And so he knew, well, he won't be going to heaven, so he'll be in purgatory. So he began a prayer vigil that this man would be let out of purgatory. For 30 days, he asked people to pray. And as legend has it, this man's brother said he had a dream that his brother came to him and said, let everybody know that I've been set free. And then from that came the idea about the purchasing indulgences, that you could pray people, that you could pray people out of purgatory, and that if you could make a donation to the church, then the church would pray for this person, and it grew. That just continued to grow and grow and grow, and we're going to see it really reach its pinnacle just before the Reformation. he believed in the inspiration of the Bible, but he believed that tradition was equal to canon, that the church dictates, and the tradition of the church was as authoritative as the Bible. He did believe in transubstantiation. He actually, I think, is the one that advocated it and came up with the idea of transubstantiation, that the body and the blood of Christ that the elements become the body, literally the body and the blood of Christ within us when we take it. He just believed that that was the only way that it meant that Christ was with us in Holy Communion. And he also, as we said, he encouraged prayers to not only for the dead, but also prayers to the saints, that those who had been venerated, those who had been sanctified as saints, you could actually speak to them, you could pray to them, that they could intercede for us between us and God. So, he did some good things. He strengthened the church in a lot of ways, in some good ways and some not so good ways. And this is the pattern that we see, that everybody's got a little dirt on them. Everybody that we're going to find in here has got a little mud on their face, on their hands, on their shoes, and nobody is a saint in this except for God Himself. So, in the midst of he did a lot to strengthen the church, but the empire itself is still crumbling, and so we see the rise of Europe. We see the little kingdoms starting to break up. And what we saw happen, particularly the largest sort of area, was the Franks, the area of the Franks, what we know as France today for the most part. Really, it's France and then encompassing a good part of Germany, Austria and some of these areas over here. What was called the Merivinian Dynasty. And what that was a family. And this is how France was working, or the land of the Franks was working at this time, is that you had this one family, and initially, and the descendants sort of were given territories. And each of these descendants had territories, and those descendants got territories, and so they were sort of broken up into these little fiefdoms, these little provinces that each one controlled. But there was no one king. There was no central authority in it. Except what was called the mayor of the palace. And it was really an administrative role. But this was the person that really was running things. And it was almost like, if those of you who have been in the service know that, the one who really runs things is like the company clerk. Right? Behind it all is the company clerk that's keeping everything running. And that's who this kind of was. He was the administrative head of things, and he was called the mayor of the palace. And this is what a man named Clovis had sort of come up with, that because everybody was, his sons and his people were too weak, so he created this position of the mayor of the palace. So the mayor of the palace sort of ruled. Then came along this man named Pepin the Elder. Okay, and do I have this here? Yeah, I do. Here we go. Pepin the Elder, 639 to 687. He was the mayor of the palace, and he was the first one to sort of say, I just want to let everybody know, I'm really the one running everything. So in case anybody gets any ideas, I'm not calling myself a king, but I'm administrator over all the little kings. His son, Pepin the Younger, made the office hereditary, so that office of the mayor of the palace would be passed down from father to son, and he actually... No, it wasn't him. It was the next guy. Charles Martel, which Martel means a hammer. Charles the Hammer was a very powerful leader, and he actually was the one that kept the Muslims, kept Islam from coming into France. Islam at this point, about 714 to 741 was his reign. Islam was about 100 years in at this point, and they had spread, and we're going to show their spread, and they had spread into Spain, Spain is, and this is why, people from Spain have dark hair, olive skin, because they had taken, the Middle Easterns had pretty much taken over that area. One of the reasons why people like myself, Sicilians, are the same way. You go to Sicily, the street signs are written in Italian and Arabic, because Sicily was part of the Muslim Empire, and and where you see the olive skin and the dark hair, more than likely there was a Middle Eastern heritage that stemmed from. But they had taken over Spain. They were going to cross the Pyrenees over into France. Charles Martel pushed them back and actually took back Barcelona and some of the northern areas of Spain and kept the Muslims at bay. So he was a very powerful and very popular ruler. And he started what's called the Carolinian Dynasty because I'm trying to think of how they say it. It's not Carlos, it's Carolal. I can't think of it now. I had to look it up because I wasn't sure. But basically, it's a Latin version of Charles. Okay? Carolus, that's what it was. Carolus. And so it's the Carolinian Dynasty, starting with Charles Martel. That started the next sort of the family dynasty. His son, Pepin the Short. Some of these guys have great names, especially after Charles. Is like Pepin the Bald, Pepin the Fat. They like their names. But Pepin the Short was the first one who was called the king of the Franks. The Pope actually, he had helped the Pope, and the Pope in gratitude crowned him king of the Franks. So that he actually held that role. It was no longer just mayor of the palace. He was the king over all these provinces in France. Charles, his son, who was ultimately called Charles the Great. Which, if you have read in your book, you know that in French, Charlemagne, or Charlemagne, is how we know him in history, was an even stronger leader than his grandfather, Charles Martel. He was pushing back the Lombards out of Italy. He was pushing everybody back. He was conquering new territory, and, well, there it is. And this became his, Charlemagne's empire. He pushed all the way into Germany, almost over by Scandinavia, well past here to East Frankish Kingdom. This was his whole kingdom, even areas into Spain. Okay, and he went to Pope Leo was first kidnapped, and then was managed to escape, or was released, but there were attempts on his life, and Charles came to his rescue. Leo sent to France and said, "I need," because the Lombards were trying to take over Italy. So Charles came and rescued Leo, pushed the Lombards back, stayed for Christmas Eve services in the Vatican at 800 AD. And in that service, Leo brought Charles forward and put a crown on his head and says, "This is the new emperor." And Charles wasn't crazy about that. He didn't know that Leo was going to do that. He didn't know that, and sort of resented it because it started an interesting precedent that we're going to see that and Leo probably meant it as a sign of gratitude, but what it did is it said, "Oh, the Pope chooses the emperor," and it started that trend. And it did two things. One, it established the primacy of the Pope over the emperor, and it also inextricably linked the church and the state to a point where there was so much overlap that where the church began and the state ended was indistinguishable. And we're going to see where that goes from here. So he felt like Leo took too many liberties, but Charles was a devout man. He was, again, any of these men, I don't know whether they were born again or whatever. He was a church guy. He was not just a pagan, secular guy. He believed that the church was important, that the church was a vital part of the empire, especially in his attempts to try to rebuild the empire. And this was really the beginning of what was called the Holy Roman Empire, because now the church and the empire were going to be, really in bed together. And this is where we sort of get into what's going on with Thyatira about this Jezebel committing adultery and sexual fornication, and I will send her into a sick bed with all those that have committed fornication with her. It was the church that was beginning to commit fornication, spiritual fornication with the government, with the empire. But Charles himself was a devout man. He had an emphasis on education. He felt that all the bishops should put together a school and that people should be educated. And he now, in order to counteract what Leo did, what Leo did, when he was stepping down, he had his son Louis crown himself king. So that, but the unfortunate thing is that Louis later, after Charles had died, Louis later went to the Pope and said, "Can you crown me too? Because that'll validate what I did." And again, just perpetuating that whole sort of scenario.
What they think they were ordained by God themselves?
The kings?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and that's where we get sort of this, because prior to this, they didn't necessarily see themselves, like the Caesars saw themselves as God. I am a god, right? The emperors after that, as the Christian empire formed, felt like they were chosen by God. Now they are being chosen by the Pope, and that's why we even see in as we get into after the Middle Ages into the 1800s, the monarchies of England and France and Spain, the divine right, that they felt that they had a divine right, a divine position, that God had made them to be king, and that they carried that authority. And this just perpetuated that whole idea that somehow God was behind them. So by 875, the Carolinian Dynasty no longer existed, because after Charles died, his descendants just didn't handle things right. They were weak leaders. The other, the German nobles were stronger, and it just broke up. And what happened? Now there was no central government anymore. There was no emperor, so to speak. And there was the popes kept on anointing people emperors, but it was a token position, because what had come in to replace it was feudalism. And we all remember in high school we had to learn about feudalism. The whole the lords and the vassals and the serfs. And this was, I remember learning and thinking, oh, this was some kind of an oppressive system. It was the economic system of the day. It was because there were no kings, there were no presidents, there was no Congress, there was no leadership. There were rich people who owned land, and they needed to have them managed. So they would have these vassals that would manage their land. And I'm going to give you a portion of land, and this is yours to manage. And then the vassals would go and hire servants to work the land, and they could live on the land, and they could eat off the land, and those were the serfs. And it was just an economic system that worked. And, it wasn't the greatest, but it was what worked, and that was what sort of took place. The problem was that it worked its way into the church. The feudal dukes in Germany needed to have a united front against the Slavs who were coming over from the Slavic states. I keep losing my thing. Here it is. From over here. They were invading over here, and they sort of needed some kind of a united front. And they elected Henry to be a king, if you will, of theirs, a king of the Germans, to push back, to be a leader to push back the Slavs. And he did that, and then he was succeeded by a man named Otto. Now, what Otto did is Otto took a lot of liberties and took over the affairs of the church in Germany. He said, look, Rome's a long way away, and we need to order things, and I'm the king, so I'm gonna dictate how things should go in the church. And the Pope really didn't have a problem with it because he helped the Pope against an adversary. And the Pope crowned him the emperor in 962. And then that was it. That was the last of the Roman emperors. Every emperor after that point, up until Napoleon, was a German emperor. But again, it was emperor in name only. He only had power over the Germans. He didn't have any power over any other area, but he was given the token name, the token title of emperor by the Pope. But what happened was there was church land the church owned land that was run by civil vassals for protection. Okay, the king would put civil vassals in charge of church-owned land so that they would be protected against, the hordes, the Slavs coming in. And then they came up with what was called investiture, which is where the civil lords and vassals, the noblemen, the king, the dukes, these civil people in leadership could choose who's going to be the bishop of this church, who's going to be the archbishop of that country, or important religious roles in the church. They were choosing it, not the Pope, and not the church leadership. That the civil authorities were beginning to appoint church offices, and then this created a thing that's called, that's what's called investiture. If you ever hear that word, okay, where the civil authorities were appointing church offices, whether it was priest, bishop, archbishop, whatever the position was, the civil authorities were choosing who were going to do it. And this created something that was called simony. And this comes from the Simon in the book of Acts, who said, look, I want your power. He saw the apostles healing people and said, look, how much is it going to cost? How much can I pay you? So what was happening now was, well, since the dukes and the kings and the political leaders were the ones appointing people in the church, people came up and says, how much do I have to pay you to be the bishop of this church? How much do I have to pay you to take on this church office? And it doesn't even matter who they are. They didn't have to have any training or anything in religion or in the Bible or anything. They could just be anybody and just get they could pay to get a position. And this is where things, you can see things will start to go downhill very, very, very quickly from there. And the Pope began to have little ability to change anything about this, and we're going to see that a little later. Last week we talked about the rise of the papacy. This week we're going to talk about the decline of the papacy. The Pope became almost completely powerless. in the midst of all the corruption and everything that was going on. But one of the things that happened during this time, and this is why, we're sort of going over something, then we're going to go back in time and go over another thing, and then go back and go over another thing. But Islam and the Crusades. This is by the end of the time that we're talking about. Okay, this is kind of what Europe started to look like. France was pushed back. The Holy Roman Empire was really a Germanic empire, right? And all these little areas were little fiefdoms, little kingdoms were popping up left and right, and there was no unity. So Muhammad, who was born in 570, lived to 632, was basically a camel herder who worked for a woman who was about 15 years older than him and later became his wife. But he liked to go off and meditate and spend time with himself and go in this cave. And one of the times in 610, he had a vision. He saw an angel, and the angel said to him, recite. And then he began to tell him things, giving him basically the Quran that supposedly exists today. Ultimately, what happens is, he said recite, not dictate, because Muhammad was illiterate and he couldn't write. And so Muhammad didn't write anything down. What happened is his successor, when he took over, said, okay, who here was writing everything down when Muhammad was talking? And about all the stuff that he received in the cave. And okay, I did. Okay, bring everything in. And they assembled it together, and they said, okay, this is the Quran. And that's what the Quran is. is what other people wrote, what Muhammad said that the angel told him.
Was the Quran ever revised?
I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, it can't even be translated. It can't even be, not legally, not in their eyes. You can't translate it out of Arabic. Even if you're Turkish, if you're a Turkish Muslim and you don't speak Arabic, you have to learn Arabic enough to read the Quran or not be able to read the Quran because it's only allowed to be read in Arabic. There are English versions, there probably are other languages, but it's not sanctioned by Islam at all. It's not allowed to be translated into anything other than Arabic. But he had his first vision in 610, and what he did is he went to a place called the Kabah. Wilfred.
Quick question, Pastor. So before 570, is Arabic word is polytheism with idol worship?
Yes, well, this is what happens, and that's exactly where I was heading with this. Is what Muhammad did is he went to Mecca in Saudi Arabia, and there was a place called Kabah, the Kabah, which was basically like a pantheon because the Saudis, it wasn't Saudi Arabia, it was just Arabia back then, but Arabia was a polytheistic society, and they believed in many gods, and you could go to this Kabah where there were many gods that were worshipped. And what happened was after his visions, he went to the Kabah and he basically rebuked them all and said, no, this one. And he pointed to this black stone. The black stone is called the Al-Hajar al-Aswad. And it was a black stone that represented this one God. It was one of the gods that was in there. And he said, no, this is God. This is Allah. Allah is just the Arabic word for God. And he said, this is Allah. And we should not worship any other gods, any more polytheism, no more believing in many gods. There's only one God, and it's Allah, and there he is. And this black stone represents him. And they threw him out because he was messing with their free trade. They were, the idol merchants. You can't sell idols. You're not going to sell as many idols if there's only one God being worshipped. So they threw him out. Well, he came back. First he came back and he conquered Medina, nearby Mecca, and gathered an army and then went back to Mecca and conquered Mecca, and then turned the Kabah into what is today it's still called the Kabah. this box here is called the Kabah, which is a shrine to Allah, and the black stone is still there. It's right kind of on the corner. I think on this one it's sort of like right there on the corner there. And they have people crowd in. They let people come in, and you can rub up against it and whatever. But it's probably like a meteorite or something that just landed in the desert. Some guy started worshiping it, and but Allah came in, and Muhammad came in and said, no, this is the only God, and we must worship Him. And that's how he started. Took Mecca. Now he died just a couple of years after taking Mecca. Yeah, Wilfred. That's okay. Yes, is there a relationship between Ishmael and Islam? Yes, because according to Muhammad, it was Ishmael that Abraham took up to the mountain, not Isaac, to sacrifice, and that Ishmael was the child of the promise, and that all the lines that follow through is the line of Ishmael, not the line of Isaac. So it's there's definitely a relationship, because that's how they see Abraham as their father. He's the father of their faith, but it follows through Ishmael, not Isaac. Tony?
Is that documented historically?
What do you mean, is it documented historically?
The line for Ishmael to Islam?
They kind of muddle it, because they sort of follow it. They almost follow the same line that the Jews do, but they say it wasn't Isaac, it was Ishmael. Even the whole line, they just sort of it's a little confusing. So I don't know that it's accurately historically documented, because don't forget, this whole theory started in the 7th century A.D. Thousands of years after it all happened. So there was no real tracking of that particular lineage. Sorry.
How was Muhammad linked Ismail and Islam? He borrowed some ideas from scriptures and put in the Quran?
All I can say is that he just came up with his own stuff. I mean, his story is that he was in the cave, and an angel spoke to him and said, these are the tenets. And and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time getting into that's another class, that we teach too in world religions, talking about the 5 tenets of Islam and the beliefs and the doctrine and that kind of stuff.
Because he's connecting the lineage of Abraham to Islam.
He's what?
He's connecting the lineage of Abraham to Islam.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. He sees Abraham as the father of Islam, and he sees Jesus in there too. He sees Moses. Moses is a prophet. Moses is part of Islam. That he was a great prophet. He sees Jesus as part of Islam, as a great prophet. So he just sat down and started coming up with his own belief system. There's no, it's very, very similar to Mormonism. Joseph Smith is out in the woods in upstate New York and sees an angel named Moroni who gives him plates, and on these plates is a book, the Book of Mormon, and it's all about how Jesus came to the United States at some point in time and preached to the natives at the time, and there was a whole society and civilization, and where did he get this from? I don't know. He just, Yeah, he ate the wrong mushroom. Yeah. I mean, something just came to him to do it, and he just did it. Whether there was something wrong with him or that he was a charlatan, we don't know. But Bob?
How does the half moon come into it? Well, this moon thing. Worshiping the half moon. Some other flags.
Yeah, the crescent moon. The crescent moon. Yeah, I'm not sure how that got worked into it. I'd have to look into that, and that has more to do with their faith and. I'm trying to remember. I think I remember at some point in world history we did talk about the half moon and the star and what it represents, but I can't think of it right now.
misunderstood Christianity and Judaism, and that's basically stirred in the pot. That's what came out of it.
Yeah, yeah, and then but they are. I mean, they are monotheistic. In other words, they don't believe they are rigid monotheists. Like the idea of a trinity is abhorrent to them. They believe in one God and a united God and a sole, monism God. That they don't believe in any kind of trinity and it's blasphemy. The interesting is that he died only a couple of years after taking Mecca. So he really, he is given credit for birthing this religion, but he really didn't even stick around very long afterwards. The greater development of Islam came after his death. Go ahead, Tracy. His successors take all of Arabia and then begin harassing the Persians and the Byzantines, and then in 641 they take North Africa, because the essence of Islam is conquest. That's conversion through conquest. That's how they took Medina, that's how they took Mecca, that's how they took Arabia, Northern Africa, and I'll go back to it in a second, but you can see the spread of Islam. Now, the red areas is what was taken in Muhammad's lifetime. So you can see it really only represents a very small area. The rest of it, this is added by 661, and the green is added by 750, and then the purple is the areas that were never taken. Although this, I think this was only by 750, because obviously this is now Islamic, Turkey, and this is where it stopped. It stopped at Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. But you can see at this point, Spain is all Islamic, except for a few northern regions up here. But that's how much was taken by 750 AD. And these are people who are his successors. And this is where does anybody know the difference between, we always hear about the Sunnis and the Shiites, right? Does anybody know the difference between the Sunnis and the Shiites?
I think it's the Sunnis believe that the caliph should be elected. I think the Shiites believe it has to be a descendant of Muhammad.
Yes. Right. Yeah. I mean, that's their basic position. And how it started was at the very beginning when Muhammad died, they said, well, who's going to take over? And there was one group that said, well, let's, those who have been his right-hand men, those who have been his leaders, should choose who should be. And his number one teacher was his father-in-law, Abu Bakr, who they voted should take over. And Sunni comes from a word that just means the tradition. This is how we do it. This is how we've always done it. This is how we're going to do it. And so that was the tradition that was started, that the leadership would choose the next caliphate. The Shia said, no, it should be a relative, not even a blood relative, but it should be in the line of Muhammad. Well, Muhammad didn't have any sons, but he had a daughter, and his daughter was married to his cousin. So they said, well, that's close enough. And his name was Ali. And Shia means the sect of Ali. It means the faction of Ali. And they represent a very small percentage, maybe 10% at the most of Islam. And the Sunnis represent 80 to 90%.
Just out of curiosity, how did Muhammad die?
I don't know. Doesn't say. He just, COVID, yeah. I don't even think he was, he really wasn't even that old. He was 60-something years old. But, a lot of infection back then, who knows. He was a pretty sick dude. I mean, I don't want to get way into it because that's for, again, like I said, for a different class. But he was I mean, this father-in-law of his, Abu Bakr, the girl who was his wife was like a 14-year-old, and he was not not a very chaste man, so that may have been his demise. But what this created was a real concern, particularly to the Eastern Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, what was left of it. The Byzantine Empire was under siege, and then they were also making their way through Spain. So the Eastern Empire cried out to the Western Empire and asked for help, and said, we need help against the Muslims. And plus, people who were going, at this time, people were still going to Israel, to the Holy Land. Christians were going to there just like we do today. Like these pilgrimages to go see the Holy Land, to see where the tomb was or whatever. But they were being harassed by the Muslims. They were not able to go there and be free and enjoy things. And so they were prohibiting people from going there and from enjoying it. So thus began the Crusades. Urban, the Pope at the time, offered the remission of sins for any soldiers that would go and fight against the Muslim armies. And there were 7 major crusades. Okay, there were 9 altogether. The last couple were meaningless. Really, most of them were meaningless, particularly this one. Again, what goes in people's mind? They thought, because they were losing, the first one was the only one that was even a little bit successful. They did take back the land. Eventually, they took it back. The Muslims took it back. But they were somewhat successful in this first crusade. They pretty much lost all the rest of the crusades. By 1212, they thought, well, what if we sent, it's our sin that's getting in the way. It's the sin of the soldiers that is getting in the way. What if we sent children in who are pure and sinless to fight these wars? And of course, the children were slaughtered and carried away into captivity, almost immediately. So it was a pretty grisly attempt. And then even the last 2 were just, all of these became just an exercise in futility. They really, in the end, it didn't do anything. And it actually weakened the soldiers' faith, because they went and they're like, what are we doing here? These are people, we're in their land, and there's a lot to be said that these were conquering places, and it's one thing to try to push them back out of, Asia Minor, push them back out of Spain and keep them from conquering. But, this had nothing to do with Europe. A lot of that Middle Eastern stuff at the time had nothing to do with Europe. And so a lot of these soldiers were like, what am I doing here? And they're seeing, they're being told that these people are animals. And they're saying, well, they're people. They may be godless people, but they're people. And they were, sort of losing their faith, because they were being forced to do things by their church.
Where did Saladin come in?
Saladin?
Yeah, the Muslim leader that actually, I guess, he took back Jerusalem from the Crusaders or whatever, the Templars.
I'm not sure, but probably very early on, because they never got it back after that first one. They took it in the first one, but then they never really, after that, the Muslims took it back, and they never lost it again. They were never able to retake the Holy Land, and it was just battle after battle. Excuse me.
Was he talking about Suleiman the Great or
Saladin. So it weakened their faith. It weakened the feudal system, because now all these people were off to war. All these men were off to war, and a lot of people weren't there to do the work. And so things were starting to fall apart. It also increased it strengthened the whole purchasing of indulgences, because now these soldiers were going off to war and dying, and we didn't know, it's like, well, we don't know if they were, You know, if they had some sin in them, they're probably in purgatory, so you're going to have to purchase indulgences. And plus, you know, a lot of these soldiers were saying, I'm going off to war. I might want to have some fun. Let me purchase some indulgences now. They'd purchase it ahead of time, you know, because they get paid well to go to fight. Yeah, I'm getting some gold. I'll give some gold to the church, and now I can go, you know, do some bad stuff and pay ahead of time. Yeah. But the interesting thing that happened was as these soldiers were coming back from the Orient, from the East, from the Middle East, they were bringing back things that were foreign to the Middle Ages, like spices and silk and garments and gold trinkets and things like that. What's that? No, gunpowder was more from China. Not so much from the Middle East, but it was merchant, commercial commodities that were foreign to Europe, and they were coming back with this thing, and it began sort of a merchant system where they would go and they would find people to buy this stuff, and then they go back. Now they're not going back as soldiers. Now they're going back as merchants. I'm going to go buy some more silk and some more spices and things, and they buy these things and they go back, and it actually brought an end to the Dark Ages, to the poverty and the misery, and it began the birth of what was called the Renaissance. You know, the Renaissance we always think of as, oh, the art and the music and and all that kind of stuff. Well, the reason was because, you know, when you have no money, you're not terribly concerned with art and music and leisurely items. You're working, you're out there, you're in the mud, you're digging ditches, you know, and this was, you know, in the Dark Ages, almost everybody was having to work hard. There were very few nobles. You know, the vast majority of Europe lived in abject poverty. So as the economy began to grow, people had more leisure time, and then they could, you know, these artists would find patrons that would pay them to paint things like the Sistine Chapel and, you know, things like that. And, you know, so you saw the birth of men like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael and all these guys to do these kinds of work. So it was, part of it was the exposure that these soldiers had in the Middle East that began that. Now, during this time in the Middle Ages, there was sort of the papacy sort of vacillated between weak and strong popes. Sometimes they had really strong leaders that really held the church together. Other times they had weak guys that just allowed all kinds of things to happen. And the papacy ended up becoming controlled by a handful of Italian families. So that's who became the pope. It's my son's turn. Your son can have it next time, you know, that kind of stuff. And the families would take turns on who would be pope. And these guys, I mean, you know, it used to be that the popes in the initial church, the ones who were called the popes, they were chosen from among the church, from the leaders of the church, from the cardinals, from the bishops, you know. And then with Gregory was the first one, the one we talked about in the beginning, who was not a bishop, who was not a cardinal, he was not, you know, a holy man, he was a monk. I mean, he was a holy man in that he was a monk, but he wasn't a leader in the church at the time. So he was the first one that was even a monk. Well, now you could be, didn't matter what you were, you didn't have to be anything. You just had to be the son of somebody, and you could be the pope. And they were chosen by the families chose them. And then when Otto came into power, we talked about Otto, and he was doing the vestiture and all that. Well, he got to a place where he was powerful enough that he was now choosing the popes too. When a pope died, you know, well, who do we have? Okay, well, I want him, you know, and he was the one doing investiture of the pope. It ended up because, you know, there was no consideration of the holiness of the piety of these men, that the papacy fell into horrible corruption, immorality, incest. The Vatican basically became a brothel, and I don't even mean that figuratively. I mean that literally, that you could go to the Vatican to, find a prostitute. And they, they would, even some of the nunneries and the convents were really just places for the priests to go and, and have their way. It was debauchery. It was Jezebel that we read about. Jezebel committing immorality and having God's servants committing immorality with her. And that was the condition of the church, was just abject immorality. And then the papal power fell back to the families, and it got even worse. Gregory the Seventh, called Hildebrand, he decided that, and he was the Pope, and he was chosen, but he said this is the wrong way to do it. He said, and what he did is he's the one that started the College of the Cardinals, and said the cardinals should be the one to choose the Pope. And but he also created he wrote this before he was even Pope. Dictatus Papae, the dictation of the Pope. And basically what it was is the Pope has supreme authority over everything, not just over the church, but over society, over the political realm, authority and judgment, even over civil authorities. And that what the Pope says is law. What the Pope says is equal to the canon.
I often heard the term
Infallibility, that was basically part of the part. There were 27 points to the Dictatus Papae, and one of them was that the Pope is infallible in his position as the Pope, and so that his things need to be followed to the T. We then come upon what's called the Babylonian Captivity of the Papacy. Okay, which is a really interesting time. This is when it's like the next thing that's going to come out is the bearded lady fire juggler. I mean, how crazy can things get? How just you're talking about the church, and you think about the awesome position that the Pope had, and the respect that was given to the Pope. And here we're going to come upon why eventually, by the time of the Reformation, people were like, Pope schmope. There was just no respect for the Pope whatsoever. So, had this one Pope named Boniface. He was a weak Pope, and he got into some fights with Edward from England and Philip from France about taxation of the church. One of his bishops got arrested for not paying taxes. So Boniface excommunicated them. Said, you got to release him. They said no. He said, okay, you're excommunicated. They kidnapped the Pope. They kidnapped Boniface. He was like 86 years old. They kidnapped an 86-year-old man. And the Pope's forces found him and rescued him and took him back to Rome. But by then, he was so weakened by the whole ordeal that he died. So Clement is the next man that was elected Pope. He was close to Philip in France. He was actually living in France, living in Avignon. It was church land, church property, essentially in France, in Avignon. And he said, you know what, I'm not going to Rome. I'm just going to stay here. So he stayed in Rome, and then and at the time, the College of Cardinals were mostly French. So as they were choosing popes, they were just choosing French popes. And so the papacy stayed in Avignon for 73 years. And in that time, Rome began to collapse. The Pope wasn't there. There was nothing there. Even the College of Cardinals had to move to Avignon. The whole papacy, everything had to move to Avignon. And Avignon was becoming very, becoming a center for people to come to, the pilgrimage, to see the Pope, to see everything was in Avignon. The whole capital of the church had been moved, and so so Rome was now in ruins. So after 73 years, Urban V finally says, "Look, I'm going to take it back to Rome. We're going to move the papacy back to Rome." There was a lot of, sort of outcry from Rome saying we need the papacy back in Rome. He said, "I'm going to bring it back to Rome." So he went to Rome, but he got homesick. He was there for a few years, got homesick, moved back to France, died. And then Gregory, another pope named Gregory, said, "No, well, I'm going to take it back to Rome." So he goes back, he moves back to Rome. And he moves back to Rome, and he dies. And the cardinals are now sort of like, well, who do we choose? And they're mostly French cardinals. And the rule is, wherever the pope died, that's where the next pope has to be chosen. And he died in Rome. Well, the cardinals are in France still. And they're saying, well, we should choose one over here. And they're saying, no, we shouldn't choose one. And so the people in Rome were actually threatening the cardinals, said, if you don't choose an Italian pope, we're going to come after you. So they said, to keep the peace, let's choose an Italian pope. So they chose Urban VI, a Roman. They regretted it because they found out that the guy was a scoundrel. The guy was not a good man. He was corrupt. He was immoral, and they changed their mind. But he's already pope, and now he began attacking the cardinals who had pulled his election away. And so they said, well, we're going to choose somebody else because we've rejected you. So they chose Clement VII, a French pope, and he was in France. So now we've got two popes because Urban didn't step down. Urban says, I'm in Rome. I'm the pope in Rome, and that's who the pope is. So I'm not leaving. I'm not going anywhere. And Clement saying, well, but they just voted me in. I'm in France, and I'm the pope. So now we have two popes. Two popes, two papacies, two college of cardinals, because when they went back to France and said, okay, we're choosing Clement, Urban said, well, I'm going to make my own college of cardinals, and he made his own college of cardinals. So now there's two whole sets of church leadership, and this went on for 40 years. In 1409, there was a general council that met in Pisa. They said they're both deposed. They said, you're both fired. They fired both popes, and they chose Alexander. Well, the two popes that were fired said, no, we're not. Now we have three popes. Alexander dies, so now we're back down to two popes, and there was another council in Constance. And because of everything, the time that had passed and everything that had happened, Gregory resigned. By then, another man named Benedict was in France and said, I object, but at that point, it was sort of a moot point. It was over. They had elected Martin to be the next pope, and he was going to rule in Rome. And the interesting thing is that the council chose Martin. He became pope, and then turned against the council. He says, I don't recognize your authority because I don't want you chose me, so now I don't want you thinking you have any authority over me. And he and his line was, who was greater, the Pope or the council that selects him? And so he repudiated the power that was against him. And this, again, this was 1409, 1410. This went on for another 100 years of just intrigue and murder and immorality. And this is the time, we get into the time of the Borgias. You guys ever hear about the Borgias? Lucretia, can't think of his name. The Borgias were a family in Italy, like the Medicis, and they were another one, the Medicis. Powerful families that were taking control of the papacy again. And they were just switching it off, and they were fighting each other and trying to see who could produce a pope. And it got really ugly. One of the things that happened while this was going on, because they saw that this is becoming a three-ring circus, is there was a movement called Conciliarism. Conciliarism was they were trying to create a council that would really be in charge, and that there would still be a pope. He would still have power, but there would be a council that could overrule him, that could fire him, that would have the ability to make decisions for the church, almost like a Congress. And it actually had a lot of momentum. The problem with that is that, when the Pope says no, you hit a brick wall. And the Pope strongly opposed it, and they ended up becoming disorganized and distracted with political affairs, and eventually it just ended. There was a council for a while, but eventually they just disbanded because they couldn't keep, without the Pope's backing, they had no impetus to keep going. And it eventually failed, and that's when the papacy just started falling into, ruin and immorality. One of the other things that happened during this time, particularly in the 1200s, 12 to 1300s, was a movement called scholasticism. And there's a number of guys, I don't want to get into all of it, but there were a number of guys that were prominent with this. Thomas Aquinas was the most prominent. He was called the great thinker of the Catholic Church. He was a Dominican. He combined knowledge and science with theology. He believed that reason can prove the existence of God, but that knowledge comes through revelation. He wrote something called the Summa Theologica. He was very submitted to the Pope, and he's the one that came up with the 7 sacraments that we see in the Catholic Church today. Very instrumental in the Catholic Church. Again, one of those guys, smart guy, trying to fix things, still very loyal to the Pope. And this was part of the problem with a lot of the movements that happened during this time, is everybody was trying to fix things. The problem was it was really broken. And it couldn't be fixed. The church had become so corrupt, had become so foul that it couldn't be fixed. It needed to be scrapped. And that's kind of where Martin Luther ended up going. We'll look at that next week. But also one of the things that happened was, because of the corruption in the papacy, it created a new movement of monasticism. We talked about monasticism last week. Well, this was a new one that started around 910, particularly Berno of Cluny received, what's that?
We're backing up then?
We're backing up a little bit now. Like I said, we kind of are going to deal with something, then go back, and it's just the easier way than trying to change subject as we're going through time, because a lot of these things were happening simultaneously. Again, this renewal of monasticism was an effort to try to get to some purity, to try to return to something that resembles a church and not just a corrupt political system, which is what the church had become. He spoke about, Berno spoke about no interference between the clergy and the laity, no local abbot, one central leadership accepted by the Pope, that they would sort of live in the community. These were like monks, but they would live in the community. And this is very much what Francis of Assisi did too, that they didn't necessarily go out. They still had the abbots, they still had some that went off and cloistered themselves, but this was a new movement that they worked with the people. They were there. They were not the priests, they were not the bishops, but these were the monks, the friars. They were mendicants, they were beggars, they took a vow of poverty, and they were called, they didn't want to be called monks, they wanted to be called friars, which meant brothers. Francis of Assisi, who was a wealthy man, converted at the age of 22. He was repulsed by wealth and luxury. He saw people suffering and wanted to help. He emphasized preaching, penance, and poverty. He preached to the common people in their language, and he was very missions-minded. And again, he didn't, those who became Franciscans didn't go off in a monastery somewhere to live in as hermits. They lived in the communities and they worked with the people. Dominic was another one. Although Dominic was formed more, when Dominic was somebody who was chosen by the Pope to form a movement that would deal with heretics in a less threatening way. Again, he was somebody who was a mendicant, a beggar. They were called the barefoot beggars. They were monks. They were or friars rather. So they were not as intimidating as the bishops and the church officials, but they were also the ones that created the Inquisition. And then they thought somebody was guilty of a heresy. You were guilty until you could prove your innocence, and you would be tortured until you could prove your innocence. Pretty rough ordeal that they went through. And again, emphasized preaching and teaching. He was a very, that's why you see a lot of the schools are Dominican schools. That was a big, teaching and education was a big part of the Dominican movement. And that was around early 13th century, 1216 or so is when he started. Now, jumping in, this was sort of what was going on in the midst of all that, all the papal controversy and the corruption. Now we have, at the very end of that, during the time when the papacy was in the Babylonian captivity in Avignon, and when they had the time of the three popes, we had a couple of men that stepped up and said, you know what, this whole system is wrong. Okay, we'll leave that up there. Gentleman named Wycliffe, 1330 to 1384. He was an English philosopher, theologian and reformer. He advocated simplicity and poverty for clergy. He attacked the ecclesiastical hierarchy. He said there's no difference between the clergy and the laity, that we're all children of God. He said every man has the right to examine the Bible for himself and that it should be in his language. And he translated the Bible into English. The first Bible ever translated into English was by Wycliffe.
In Jesus' letter to Thyatira, he starts out with a commendation. Is he speaking about these people now that you're talking about?
That's part of it. Yeah, and that's part of what he's saying is, I know your works is, in two ways. One, that, and he says your latter works are better than your former works. Because if you look at the Catholic Church today, most of what the Catholic Church does today, the Catholic Church did great strides in creating hospitals, orphanages, universities, doing great works. Now, he's not necessarily saying that these were works of God or that these were godly works, but saying that you did some great works and your latter works are going to be better than your first, because these are the early works that we're listening to tonight, which are pretty abysmal. Although sprinkled in are some good things going on. In particular, these two men. And he said that the church edicts must be weighed against the Bible, that the Bible should have superiority over the church edicts. He said that the Pope is not a successor to Peter. I mean, this guy was a radical, right? He was against transubstantiation. He spoke against it. And he would go out, he used to write, he wrote the Bible, but he translated the Bible into English, and he used to write tracts and used to hand them out. He used to have little pamphlets and handing them out all over the place. That's why even today you have Wycliffe Publishing. That's what he was known for, publishing, send things out, get things out there. Drove the church crazy. They chased him, but they never could find him. They did call him in to answer, and he answered, what he believed, and they didn't like it, at one time, and then they let him go. And then he really got ramped up and really started attacking the church, and they were looking for him, and they could never find him, and he died quietly and, in a rural home somewhere in England, and they never found him. Unfortunately, John Huss didn't have the same experience. He was a follower of Wycliffe. John Huss was from Bohemia, which is modern-day Czech Republic. and he received, there was sort of a marriage between one of the princes of England and one of the princesses of Bohemia. So there was sort of a connection between England and Bohemia. And so a lot of Wycliffe's materials made it to John Huss's area. And he read it and he said, this guy's onto something. And he was a follower of his teaching. He stressed preaching the gospel. He attacked clergy abuses. He opposed veneration of the Pope. He said only Christ can forgive sins. Again, he's taken Wycliffe and he's even taking it to another level. Now, he still supported purgatory and transubstantiation, but, he was trying to take the church back to the Bible and trying to take the church back to its origins in the book of Acts. He was tricked into going to a council in Constance, like, oh, no, we want to hear what you have to say. And he got up and they said, will you renounce? And he was very much like Luther, who said, okay, just show me where I was wrong. Held up his Bible, said, show me where I'm wrong, and I'll renounce it. I'll take back everything I said if you show me where I'm wrong. And Huss said the same thing. And then they started accusing him because they knew they couldn't win that argument, so they started accusing him of heresies that he never even taught, and accusing him of doing things that he never even did. And so they arrested him at this council, and they dragged him out and they burned him at the stake. And and these were the guys that started. It was the beginning of the end, because then after this, like I said, the papacy grew just ugly and corrupt and immoral, and the whole thing of indulgences became even worse. Wilfred?
Before Reformation, does the church has a true faith, where we can see from the first treaty church, still have believers, or
I'm not sure if I know what you mean.
no, before Reformation?
For the Reformation?
Yeah. Does the church still have true believers?
Oh, yeah, there were true believers. I mean, guys like, I think, Huss and Wycliffe and certain ones of the popes, I think, were true believers, but there was just so much corruption in the system. And that's why, when we read about Thyatira, he's talking about the system, not the people. He's talking about the people. He says, I'm not going to put any further burden on you. In talking about the people, he's saying, I know your works. But talking about the system, he's saying that woman Jezebel, that's what he's talking about. The system was just because of the intermingling of the church and the state was so corrupt that the church had just atrophied, and the church had just become like a political institution. And there was just very little faith left in the church. And that's why these guys are called the Pre-Reformation guys, because just 100 years before the Reformation, these guys were screaming it. It's the whole system is broken and needs to be replaced. They're talking about the Pope doesn't have all authority. That the Word of God has authority, and he's talking against transubstantiation. He's talking against all these pillars of the Catholic Church that are not found in the Bible. Wycliffe and Huss are just saying the system is broken. And yeah, there are believers, because, the average people, it's like today, the average people out there in a lot of churches, you sit and talk to a Catholic who loves the Lord, just only because I know Rick's history, that he was a guy that was in the Catholic Church and was a believer, and I mean in the Catholic Church, teaching in the Catholic Church, but was a believer, and you sit down with, somebody in the Catholic Church that loves the Lord, and they're a believer. Now, the system is a different thing. I don't defend anything about the system of that church. But there are people in it, no matter what, that find the Lord. Eventually, I'm sure Rick is thankful for this, the Lord finds them and pulls them out and brings them to a place where they can grow. But a lot of the problem is in the system of it, and you see that in a lot of churches, even churches today. The mainline Protestant churches, there are people in it that love the Lord, but the system has become so corrupt. The system has become so institutionalized that Jesus stopped coming years ago. And maybe they're teaching, maybe they're reading the Word, and hey, the Word has power, whatever. People can still be reached. There are people who can know the Lord somehow. But it's, you're always going to find people, pockets. God will always preserve a remnant in the church, and that's what we have seen through this. There's always been sort of men that rise up and say, no, we're going to fix things, and then it falls apart. And then other men rise up and we're going to fix things, and then it falls apart. And then you have men like this who are saying, no, it just needs to be, the whole system needs to be tossed out. And ultimately, next week when we talk about Martin Luther, that's what happens. He's a guy who I believe was saved in the Catholic Church, was a believer in the Catholic Church. But then the veil was pulled back and he saw, these indulgences, people buying their way out of purgatory. I'm going to go tie one on tonight, so I'm going to pay ahead so I can go out and tie one on. He's looking at that going, wait a minute, that can't be what that means. That can't possibly be what it means. I mean, not only is that wrong, but also, so that means poor people have to spend time in purgatory longer than rich people. And he had a real problem with that. And that's one of the things that stirred him up to say, no, the system's broken, and it just needs to be tossed out, and we need to start with something else. So that's the ugliest picture of the church is during this time. And and there's a lot of stuff in the book that I didn't cover. So if you got your book, make sure you read through it at some point, to get all the ugliness out of it, just to see how faithful God is to maintain his church through all this. The fact that guys like Wycliffe and Huss and Luther could be produced out of this church at this time, and maybe that's just it, is they just said, no, this is not, the emperor has no clothes. At some point, somebody says, no, I'm not buying it anymore. It's just too, this cannot be, God cannot be in this. So, any questions, comments? Sure.
This talk about basically the Catholic religion. What year did it kind of turn around a little bit?
Yeah. They did. We're going to learn about this next week, so I won't get too deep into it. But it's what was called the Catholic Counter-Reformation. After they got done going to war against the Protestants, then they sort of took a look at themselves and says, well, maybe we need to change a few things and make a few adjustments, and not be so so corrupt and immoral. And
That's when Joan of Arc came in, is during that war?
no, I don't think it was during that war, was it?
Well,
Against the Protestants?
1431.
No, we're talking 1520s. 1520s, 1530s, the Protestant War. The Reformation, he did his 1517 was when he put his theses on the wall. So, this was during this time. Joan of Arc was during this time. Again, another one. Somebody hear me. Questions? Okay, let's pray.